I'm Shihoka Goto. I'm the Senior Associate for Northeast Asia with the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Thank you very much for joining us. For those of you who were able to join us in the morning, we actually had a very good, solid discussion as well as a keynote speech discussing cybersecurity threats and potential attacks from North Korea, China, Russia, and the vulnerabilities of the highly interconnected economies in the industrialized world, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. This afternoon, we're actually going to build on the lunch speech made by Irene Inoue of the U.S.-Japan Council, who spoke at length about cooperation following the Fukushima disaster of 2011, and she focused very much on public-private partnership initiatives that her group is spearheading through the Tomodachi Initiative. Unfortunately, headlines over the past few weeks about Harvey, Irma, monsoons in India, and earthquakes in Mexico have only highlighted the fact that natural disasters are inevitable. And we can, of course, argue about the causes for the seeming frequency as well as the intensity of hurricanes and typhoons worldwide in recent years. And we can also debate about the role global warming may or may not have in bringing about these disasters. But one unshakable truth is that these natural disasters are deadly, and they destroy lives and livelihoods, and they put a tremendous strain on local and national budgets. So can we get better at predicting natural disasters? Can governments at local, national, and transnational levels prepare better for the inevitable? And how can private-public partnerships be enhanced to bear some of the financial burdens of the preparedness and reconstruction following these natural disasters? There are many, many questions to be asked, but we have a stellar group of panelists who should be able to answer some of these pressing issues that we face today. I would like to introduce them in the order that they will be speaking today. First off is perhaps we go by the distance that they have traveled as well. Undoubtedly, Alain has traveled the furthest. Alain Guillou is a former honorary research associate in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong, and he came here via Madagascar. He is also a former executive and a member of the board and member of the International Council of Médecins Sans Frontières. Following him will be James Schaff, who is a senior fellow of the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And his research at Carnegie focuses on US-Japan relations and regional engagement, East Asian security, Japan's political economy, and alliance collaboration in high-tech fields. He also served previously as a senior advisor for East Asia policy at the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense and as Director of Asia-Pacific Studies at the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. And then finally, but certainly not least, is the Wilson Center's Roger Mark de Souza, who directs the Center's Population, Environmental Security and Resilience program here. The program focuses on climate change resilience, reproductive and maternal health, environmental security and livelihoods, including the Global Sustainability and Resilience Program, Environmental Change and Security Program, as well as the Maternal Health Initiative. So with that, I turn to Alain. Thank you.
Thank you, Shihoka, and thank you to the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Wilson Center for inviting me to participate in this panel. When I received the invitation, I felt both thrilled and somewhat challenged. Thrilled because that's a topic that is dear to me, as I was in charge in various functions with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, for many years, which sort of made me confront a number of disasters, and I wouldn't miss an opportunity to share ideas on how best to respond to the range of disasters that I experienced during this year. I'm also an islander. I live on a small island outside of a small outlying island, just outside Hong Kong Island itself, where we regularly face typhoons, as we call them there, tropical storms. So, of course, my thoughts first go to fellow islanders and all the others struggling to recover from the recent events in Hurricane Irma. Now, why challenge is because when I received your invitation, I was actually stuck in a small fishing village on the western coast of Madagascar without any proper internet access, and I knew I would have just a few days on my way back through Hong Kong to try and fill up my gaps in recent knowledge and events. But I'm sure I didn't do a perfect job, so I also trust my fellow panelists to help fill those gaps. I believe another challenge is the conceptual one, because the field of disaster relief and humanitarian action doesn't rest on very strongly accepted concept. There's still no perfect consensus on ideas of resilience, of what a natural disaster means. Traditionally, we used to make the distinction between natural and man-made disasters, but then a lot of discussions and a lot of research has also questioned that. I mean, is there such a thing as a natural disaster? So I prefer to talk about natural hazard, which may or may not result in disasters. Among the wide range of disasters I confronted, I would distinguish also the slow-moving ones like food security challenges, famine, climate change, and the fast-moving situations, the rapid onset situations, tropical storms, earthquakes, epidemic outbreaks, tsunamis, landslides, flash floods. I could add volcanic eruptions, etc. Because of time constraints, I want just to focus on a set of slow-moving disasters, including geophysical hazards, weather-related hazards, and technological hazards. Why do I add the technological hazards? It's because they often mix and mix with other natural hazards and result in what is variously called compound disasters, chain disasters, what other cascading disasters, and so on. But even I think this conceptualization is not adequate, because these chains and cascade have they sort of hint at linear phenomena, whereas I believe that we still lack very effective models, in particular, to describe the phenomena that surround disasters, the most usually negative feedback loops, for which we don't have, since we don't have clear concepts around that, we also don't have necessarily adequate responses. Now, an example of, the most dramatic example being, of course, the Tohoku earthquake and Fukushima nuclear incident that followed. Well, this is, I think, this is the most dramatic example of one of these compound disasters that mix nature and technology. But it's by no means the only one. That's what we see every time, basically. Why? Because of our use of technology, because of urbanization, because of critical infrastructure being built in areas at risk, and so on. So, of all these phenomena, I see what I see for this region, for East Asia, is that most of these factors are kind of exacerbated. So we have the density of population, I mean the sheer numbers, but also the density of population, which is an issue, excuse me. We also have the lower urbanization, the currently lower urbanization rate than on other continents, which gives a boost to rural migrations, to colonization of low elevation coastal zones and other areas at risk. We have a place which holds most of the words mega cities. We have the Ring of Fire on the first island chain with its entire range of natural hazards, volcanic eruptions. And we also have in that region a number of fault lines at sea crisscrossing the region and carrying a strong risk of tsunami. And then we have 20 to 25 tropical storms every year that run through the entire region, and each of them can potentially affect hundreds of millions of people. So these are all the key, I mean, the ingredients that make East Asia a scene of particular concern and particularly high risk. Now, where does, as I've been prodded to talk a bit more specifically about Taiwan, where does Taiwan stand in all this picture? Well, we have the type of disasters is the same that affects the region year in, year out. So among the 20 or 25 typhoons that strike the region every year, more than half of them actually run through Taiwan. We have volcano eruption, we have earthquakes, we have 2 fault lines surrounding the island. So we have a high, again, a very high risk of hazards that could lead to disasters. Now there's an additional, well, I should talk also about the response capacities of Taiwanese authorities to this situation. Well, the response capacities used to be actually very weak and disorganized throughout the 1990s and even the 2000s. Then there was a jolt, like an event that changed that, was a particular typhoon in 2009, Typhoon Morakot, which killed hundreds of people in a landslide and led to a reorganization of disaster relief in Taiwan. Well, one important aspect was that a specific disaster legislation was a disaster response legislation was passed in 2010, and the armed forces and civilian authorities were all reorganized to be better able to respond to disasters. How much progress have they made? Well, they've definitely made progress, and this has been recognized, including in a recent report from the RAND Corporation, that the response is now better organized. But there is also the specific situation, geopolitical situation of Taiwan that comes into play, because not being recognized as an independent nation, as an independent state, leads to Taiwan being somehow cut off from a lot of UN assistance. And bilateral assistance too has been sort of not necessarily blocked, but often delayed by China, on the basis that before helping Taiwan, countries should ask Beijing's authorization to do so. And that's something that people in Taiwan have resented a lot. So a difficult, a kind of difficult situation. But at the same time, Taiwan is also helping. Taiwan has promoted disaster relief overseas. It was pretty rhetorical during the 90s and 2000s, but with the Ma administration, we've seen a change also, and the first organization of a joint relief operation after Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 in the Philippines, which included the Navy, the Air Force, plus locally established Taiwanese NGOs. So what happens now, we don't know. The DPP has very ambitious plans to build, in particular, a hospital ship and to establish a humanitarian logistical base on Taiping Island, an island which is in the middle of the South China Sea, controlled by Taiwan, not recognized as an island by the UN, but where the Thai government has hoped to establish this kind of base. They have taken steps to do this, and it's not clear to what extent the island will be eventually possibly used as a humanitarian base. Now, I would conclude by a few ideas on the role of the US in the region, the possible role of the US in disaster risk governance in East and Southeast Asia. I think I'm using the term disaster risk governance because I think the US government should be interested in all aspects, not just in direct relief and response. The first point is that definitely the US should take stock of the extent of the threats, the coming disasters linked to all the risk factors that I have listed earlier. Why? Because this is a risk to political and social stability in any affected country, if not the whole region. The second is to also take into account the large ambitions of regional powers in terms of using military assets in disaster response, because this is the case not just of the US, but also of Japan, of China, and of Taiwan. So this requires coordination if you again want to avoid instability in international relations. So promote communication, complementarity, joint exercises. I think these are important things to take into account, and try to induce basically cooperation rather than competition. And I would add, take also into account the dangers of overconfidence, because many countries have develop their capacities to the point where they think they can answer by themselves to a range of disasters, basically the usual one, the recurrent one. But at the same time, with the rising level of threats and risks, I think most countries have actually a decreasing capacity to respond to mega disasters, those that are of a much higher intensity or not usual. And this is, of course, particularly important in a region which doesn't have an integrated security organization, unlike what you could find maybe in Europe, in Africa, or in the Americas. Of course, there is ASEAN for Southeast Asia, but its initiatives and reach have so far been very limited, certainly not to the point of responding to mega disasters. Lastly, I would add that what I see as the biggest disaster for the future is none of the things I have mentioned so far, but actually the biggest disaster is what is happening in the ocean. It's the rapid destruction of an entire ecosystem, the coral reefs of the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, which as a keen diver and marine conservation activist, I can see year after year happening under my eyes. Now, this means also wiping out a key source of food for humanity in general, but most critically for East and Southeast Asia. So to address this kind of geopolitical issue, of course, we have to refer to the climate change issues and climate change negotiations, which maybe could be addressed in your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those very sobering thoughts, and also the two things that really particularly struck out were pointing out the unique situation that Taiwan finds itself politically actually spilling over into the disaster relief scenario as well, and indeed too about the role the military plays in disaster relief. I do want to make 2 points, totally unrelated, but housekeeping rules, and I would be remiss not to make them. This event is being live webcast, so we do have an audience joining us online. And secondly, I was very remiss in not acknowledging and thanking profusely our co-sponsors, the FPRI, Foreign Policy Research Institute, especially Alan Luxembourg and Jacques Delisle. So with that, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much, Shihoko. It's a great pleasure to be here, and my thanks to the organizers as well for the opportunity to talk to you all. Overall, I'd like to make kind of 4 major points related to this issue, and I think my talk may complement those of some of the others here. And I will address Asia generally, but I will end up focusing a lot on Southeast Asia for some of the points that Alain talked about. Many of the other players in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, have capacity more or less to deal with many of the disasters that they face. Less so in Southeast Asia, particularly given the challenges, the hazards that confront them. But my first major point is to underscore that from a U.S. perspective, and from a U.S. and an allied perspective in the region, this is not, assisting with disaster relief and resilience in the region is not an altruistic endeavor. I think it's a very strategically important endeavor for the United States because of the strategic importance of Southeast Asia, from an economic point of view, from a security point of view, and from a diplomatic point of view. The 10 ASEAN members in Southeast Asia collectively form the 6th largest economy in the world, just a touch behind the United Kingdom, and will probably soon surpass it. It's the 3rd largest labor force in the world, behind China and India. A very young demographic makeup in Southeast Asia overall compared with many other countries. U.S. trade with ASEAN more than doubled from 1990 to 2015 to become America's 4th largest trading partner. And the United States is one of the largest foreign direct investors in Southeast Asia, with the largest stock overall. As Alan referred to, the South China Sea is a particularly important resource for many reasons, but 10% of the global fish catch comes from the South China Sea, and roughly 400 million people live within 100 kilometers of the South China Sea coastline, or about 60 miles, because of various factors, but not the least of which is the draw that is the riches of the South China Sea. This concentration of people not only puts great environmental pressure on the sea and fuels competition and conflict, which is a whole separate topic on territorial disputes and competitive fishing, but they're also vulnerable to storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, sea level rise, and the like. And I think it's this challenge of the regional commons that creates both the need but also the opportunity for cooperation, and which can then better position the United States and its allies and partners in the region to address other important strategic issues. So my first point is it's strategically important for the United States to invest in disaster relief and resilience in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'll combine my second and third main points, which are first, that we meaning all of the nations in the region and international organizations, have invested a whole lot of time and money in this area, especially since the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was a real watershed in terms of regional activism and response, and it came at a time when the member states of ASEAN were increasingly capable of contributing to their own benefit in this role. So we've done a lot of work in this area, and there's a lot to be proud of and to build upon. And the third point that combines with that is the United States and Japan and other key players in the region are a big reason why that we have made so much progress in that area. We've seen in particular the growth of disaster relief training opportunities in Asia due to what is largely a marriage of convenience. National and regional disaster relief interested organizations actively seek military participation of various nations to bolster their training activities, given the military's prominent role in large-scale disaster response and the resources that they offer. Now, defense, on the other hand, defense policy officials and military leaders are eager for non-controversial ways to expand security cooperation and confidence building in the region. So this has all kind of come together in this marriage of convenience surrounding disaster relief. The explosion of training opportunities is, I think, both a blessing and a curse. You know, there never has there been a more vibrant and constructive process of multilateral cooperation in East Asia, involving the widest possible range of countries and organizations, including NGOs and international organizations. But it can overwhelm these communities and make it very hard to maintain continuity and high quality in the programming. So some rationalizing of activity and truly capturing and internalizing the lessons learned continues to be a major challenge going forward, in part because of such frequent turnover in these various positions and institutions. But the infrastructure for this is better. A couple of examples. The ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, the AHA Center, in Indonesia became functional in late 2011, followed later by the establishment of a disaster emergency logistic system for ASEAN, and a special emergency stockpile hub in Subang, Malaysia, which came online in 2013. Japan was a major contributor through its JICA aid programs and ASEAN integration initiative programming that helped support this. Building on this emerging infrastructure, the United States used its membership in the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF, to help establish the first ever field exercise, or what they called the Voluntary Demonstration of Response in 2009, co-sponsored with the Philippines. The concept was to carry out a civilian-led, military-supported disaster relief demonstration involving multiple countries, and in the process, deliver real assistance to local communities in the host country, in this case, the Philippines. 26 countries from around the region participated in that first exercise. 14 contributed assets, included about 500 civilian and military personnel. And every other year, they carried on this ARF exercise, what they eventually labeled the DREX, which occurs every 2 years because it takes that long to plan. Japan and Indonesia co-led the second occasion in 2011, which grew in size to over 4,000 participants from 26 countries, including the European Union, 7 international organizations such as the UN agencies and International Federation of the Red Cross. South Korea and Thailand stepped up as co-leads in 2013, Malaysia and China notably in 2015. Despite the growth and the action-oriented nature of DREX, the rest of the ASEAN Regional Forum had trouble kind of replicating this proactive approach to multilateral security cooperation in other areas like counterproliferation or counterterrorism, et cetera. So the nations in the region created what they call the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, which is ASEAN Defense Ministers plus other key nations in the region, the ADMM Plus, which was built to be a little bit more practical and create a forum for defense-related cooperation. And not surprisingly, the Humanitarian Assistance Disaster Relief Expert Working Group in the ADMM Plus became the kind of the leading group, that together with military medicine, because of its non-controversial nature. There's another ASEAN-led activity in its Regional Disaster Emergency Response Simulation Exercise, or RDEX, which simulates major natural disaster in the region and tests a coordinated response. That often involves non-ASEAN countries and observers, and that began in 2005. There's AHX, which is another ASEAN organized large-scale disaster relief, and these are all in addition to the DREX that I mentioned earlier. They involve hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, can take up to 2 years to plan. Several bilateral and multilateral planning meetings take place in the process leading up to this, which fosters multilateral cooperation, information exchange, familiarity with each other, and each other's processes. This puts a significant drain on the resources that each country has of people that specialize in this area, and this challenge is exacerbated by the number of regional and bilateral exercises that have used disaster relief as a organizing principle around some of their activities. Now, there has been some rationalization in recent years, and it's interesting to note, I don't think there's a DREX exercise this year, and I think it's being combined with the RDEX, and this is all part of the One ASEAN initiative that began last September, which I think holds some promise. I think it's important also to highlight the U.S. and Japan role. I mentioned some of the funding for some of the institution building in terms of forward deployed assets in the AHA Center. For several years, Pacific Command and the U.S. military has hosted what they call the MPAT program, Multilateral Planning Augmentation Team, which is a way of bringing military professionals from all over the region together to develop standard operating procedures for certain multilateral activities that are non-confrontational or non-military. So when multilateral task forces are put together, whether it was Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines or others in subsequent years after the Indian Ocean tsunami, the number of MPAT-trained people who are all sitting around in a room from different countries sharing their computers is often around 60 to 70% have gone through this program of reviewing the standard operating procedures. So that in many ways, they're working not just from their own national training program. It's a true multilateral training process in this regard. The process of air traffic control, for example, and an immediate response of dealing with helicopters going back and forth contributed by multiple nations is a huge challenge, and usually that has fallen to the United States in the beginning with either through aircraft carriers or other types of assets. Now Japan has developed large helicopter carrying platform ships, and in Typhoon Haiyan there was actually a handover where the U.S. initially handled the air traffic control for the initial response, and then when that ship left the region, passed the reins to the Maritime Self-Defense Forces of Japan in that. So I think China's entry into this process is very encouraging, and it's one of the few areas where U.S. China, Japan China, mill-to-mill collaboration, cooperation is progressing. And China has a lot to offer, not only financially. They have a great deal of experience with mass migration or mass events, dealing with large numbers of people who have been displaced by some sort of domestic disaster. They don't necessarily have the expeditionary capability to kind of get massive assets overseas quickly, but they do have a lot of talent, and they're becoming more expeditionary. Finally, the last key point I want to make is where do we go from here in terms of the types of things we need to continue to focus on? So we have a great infrastructure. We have a need, I think, a strategic need to continue to invest in this. To me, it's a combination of bilateral and minilateral cooperation. So between the United States and Japan, between the United States and Korea, working also directly with China, or small little trilateral groups to keep the disaster relief and preparedness component in these relationships, because this is what helps operationalize wider multilateral collaboration. ASEAN by itself has great challenges and difficulties. We saw it with the Malaysian airliner disappearing and trying to cover wide areas. There are new programs that are leveraging satellite assets, computer assets of all of our different countries. U.S. and allied leadership and participation, I think, is going to be increasingly important. And I think beyond the physical platforms, supply chain management skills are critical. We've seen in the past the ability to deploy a wide area network mobily, so that everyone has essentially massive Wi-Fi connectivity in responding to these disasters. These are the types of things that I think we can continue to respond to. And the final plug I guess I'd make too is to think about, again, kind of from a strategic context, as we look at North Korea developing nuclear weapons and the danger of some kind of nuclear incident, potentially accident or catastrophe involving North Korea, having some of our attention in the disaster relief, disaster response area enable our ability to collaborate in Northeast Asia, I think will become, involving China, involving Russia, and others, will be an area potentially of focus in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Before I turn to Roger Mark, there one question. I do understand the strategic need to invest in military-to-military cooperation, but at the same time, it seems too that we are asking a great deal from the military, especially from the U.S. military, which is also strained in engaging in non-traditional combat roles such as nation-state building, post-war reconstruction. Add to that, we're adding disaster relief. Do we have enough money? Is this affordable?
Well, it's not even just a matter of money, frankly, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that, as I was running out of time, I skipped a little part of my presentation, which primarily deals with the idea that the military is really a last resort and should really only be used in very limited significant situations for a variety of reasons. Part of it is cost. The use of military assets in these events are very expensive. The Defense Department in Atlanta has, 400,000 humanitarian daily rations ready to go on a moment's notice, but that doesn't mean if there's any possible way that relief supplies and food can be resourced more locally, that's better in terms of it's cheaper, it's faster, and it supports the local economy. There are all kinds of reasons why you would not focus primarily on the military as the answer to this problem. As you say, they're trained primarily for other things. So even military medicine, military doctors are trained more for battlefield injuries, not necessarily the types of injuries you see in natural disasters. There's been great progress in public-private partnerships, the use of UPS, TNT, and Agility as partners with the UN Global Logistics Cluster, started in 2008 as a way to get private sector aircraft and logistical support to be a part of these things. So I think the military is the last resort, and part of my plug for the U.S. not giving up on the strategic importance of this is also to give a shout out to Congress that has kind of rejected the Trump administration's proposals budget-wise to cut back severely on foreign aid and other types of assistance in the region that would build capacity and build resilience in many of these countries in the first place. That's often the most effective and inexpensive way to respond to this. So for all my highlighting of the military dynamic, I think you're absolutely right, and I want to keep that in perspective because it's really a holistic vision in this sense.
Right. Thank you. Hey, Roger Mike.
Thank you very much. I think that's the perfect segue, actually, to what I'd like to talk about. So over lunch, I think you heard a little bit about public-private partnership. You heard from Alain about ways that he has been looking at this based on his experience in Médecins Sans Frontières and others. And you heard a little bit of from Jim in terms of looking at the strategic interest, security, and military engagement. I want to talk about the questions around disasters from a different perspective, building on this term that we have been using on the panel of resilience, and talk a little bit about what this means at the level of communities and how communities are being engaged to respond to these hazards in the region. And I'd like to start by presenting this image, which you see is a simulation of the tsunami from 2004, where more than 250,000 people were killed. And what you see is the simulation from when the first wave happened and the third wave. And I had gone in the region working with communities in the post-tsunami recovery period, and was engaging with a number of individuals and communities who had survived, who basically were able to retreat in that short period of time. And one of the key questions that they had was, what could we have done differently? Why did this have to happen this way? And I want to talk a little bit about that. Alain has referred to a lot of the hazards that we know are prevalent in the region. And you can't see the details here very well, but what I'd like you to focus on are the colors. So the areas that you see in orange are areas that look at drought and drought-related water and food insecurity. In a dark blue, you have areas that are looking at increased coastal, riverine, and urban flooding, and we've seen this most recently in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. The areas in green focus on tropical storms. We've been mentioning Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. We had a little bit of a discussion of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan in 2011. The areas in yellow look at some of the threats around climatic shifts and changes in rainfall patterns and temperature changes which disrupt the ecosystem and threaten traditional livelihoods in agriculture and fishing. There's also the increased risk of heat-related mortality. And then the areas in light blue looks at questions around sea level rise. So as we've heard, there are a number of hazards in the region that potentially can lend themselves to becoming disasters. So it's important that we look at this. Allah and others have referred to questions around urban growth and risk in vulnerable areas. And this map shows areas of population density in low elevation coastal zones. And these are characterized as coastal areas within 10 meters of sea level, and they're naturally prone to flooding. So look at what we see in terms of population concentrations and settlement patterns in these coastal areas that are very vulnerable geographic spaces in and of themselves. So increased vulnerability within the region. We want to think also about flooding vulnerabilities. What you see represented here are people in the region that are most exposed to regular flooding. So there's a large percent of populations on the continent that live in low elevation coastal areas. And islanders like Alain are particularly vulnerable. So we have a clear sense of these vulnerabilities. And we know that these hazards and vulnerabilities can lead to clear cases of destruction. And as we know, in typhoon, 16 million people were affected, more than 6,000 deaths. Many homes were damaged or destroyed. So real impact here on people's lives and their well-being. We were also looking most recently at the flooding in Bangladesh, India, and Nepal. Over 43 million were affected by the monsoon rains and flooding. Over 1,200 deaths were reported. So a clear sense of real dangers and vulnerabilities. But it's really important that we continue to focus on those who are the most vulnerable and who have the least capacity to respond. And very often, we're looking at cases of women or the very poor. And this is also an important consideration in terms of how disaster relief is allocated, those monies that come in immediate post-disaster. I remember in the post-tsunami going to so many communities and talking to a lot of families and a lot of women saying that all of the relief that my family got went to my husband. I really had no decision-making power in terms of how this relief money was being allocated to my household and to my community. So how do we scratch beneath the surface of how we can address these questions and look at vulnerabilities and hazards and begin to think about how we can plan for these potential disasters? And of course, we've been talking about resilience, a very popular term. As Alain has indicated, there isn't full consensus on what it means. There isn't even a full appreciation of all the benefits. There are a number of shortcomings with regard to this concept of resilience. But generally, we're looking at a context, which is a social group, a region, and institution, and we focus on the resilience of what? There's a disturbance that can be a natural hazard, conflict, food shortage, high fuel prices that produces a shock, a disruption. Alain has also mentioned these slow-moving stresses. So there's a question of resilience to what? We've also touched on the question of the capacity to deal with this resilience or this shock or this stress at what level. What's the level of exposure? What is the level of sensitivity? How is that differential for different systems? Is it different for an urban system versus a coastal system? Is it different for different communities? Is it, can you disaggregate this according to gender or socioeconomic status? So we look at the level of sensitivity and ultimately the capacity to respond, to adapt. And ultimately, what happens out of this? What is the reaction to the disturbance? So Do they survive? Do they cope? Do they recover? Do they learn? So we talk about this inability of being able to bounce back better, bounce back, recover, but they can be worse than before or they collapse. So this is a general framing in which we look at these connections as we look at some of the stresses and shocks, we look at vulnerability, we look at these hazards, and we try to have a sense of how disaster planning and response fits into that context. So as we embark in this work, we also try to get a sense of what are some of the indicators that we can look at that will make sense and will help us better understand the impact that we are having. What are some of the factors that we try to foster? So, and we look at this, for example, in an urban setting, but also this is where the sense of working with the corporate sector and public-private partnerships is also important. Do they have a role to play in disaster mitigation? So we talk about the diversity of a response, the degree to which a community comes together, can they adapt, are they able to have a varied resource productive base so that they're not overly reliant on one set of factors which increases their vulnerability. What is their level of vulnerability? What does it mean for stability? And what is the potential for recoverability? So these are some of the indicators that we typically look at when we talk about resilience. So the overall framing is to try to understand how all of these factors come together and ultimately present opportunities for us to think about harnessing a resilience dividend. So what you have here are a series of external shocks on the left that are tied to natural disasters, cybersecurity threats, terrorism, and then on the right you have these slow-burning stresses. So unreliable public transportation, water scarcity, corruption, poverty. At the top then, that drives this are accelerators. And these can be things like globalization, climate, urbanization. So how do these pieces all come together when we recognize that we're slower to adapt to these set of circumstances, that our ability to respond is more constrained? It actually is harder to respond when we pull all of these factors together, and that means that it's longer to recover. So we put all of these parameters together and figure out what it means ultimately in terms of investments and respond mechanisms. So what does it mean for infrastructure development, for economic diversification, for preparedness, community cohesion, safety law, urban planning and design, and how does that play out at the level of communities, of businesses and institutions, and what's the role of the government in that context? So how does this idea of the resilience dividend play out when we look at some of the threats that we see with regard to disasters, and what are some of the potential resilience dividends that we have been seeing at the level of communities as communities respond and engage to these threats and hazards? So it's quite clear that there is an education dividend. Our colleagues at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis have done some studies and modeling around education and differential vulnerability to natural disasters. And they have looked at this in the context of pre-disaster, when a disaster event occurs, and post-disaster. And the things that they looked at were things around risk awareness and understanding, preparedness, understanding of warning messages, the ability to evacuate, and then post-disaster, what were some of the impacts, how do they cope, and what were some of the long-term impacts. And not surprisingly, what they found was that in those communities where there's a higher level of investment in secondary education, at the country level, there were lower levels of mortality and better disaster preparedness and response. At the level of the community, there was lower mortality and animal losses, so very important in terms of livelihood questions. Consumption and income smoothing was better in terms of being able to deal with the disruption. And at an individual level, there's higher disaster preparedness. So individuals who are better educated tended to avoid living in vulnerable areas. They're less reliant on natural resources for their livelihoods. They understand information on disaster and community risk better. They also recover from traumatic stress more rapidly and are less likely to adopt coping strategies that reduce their human capital investment, like taking children out of school. So there's a very clear link between looking at education levels and the importance of investing in education that allows an opportunity to maximize disaster planning, response, and post-recovery. So an important dividend that we try to have a better sense of and how we can continue to support that. Another dividend that we have been looking at are questions around linking health impacts, community mobilization, and natural dividends. So this comes out of an integrated development program in a number of coastal areas in the Philippines that has been implemented by our colleagues at Save the Children. And this is actually a community health program. So community members go to the health clinic, which is what you see on the right, for health services. As part of an integrated delivery system of health service provision, they go through a disaster preparedness exercise where they get together with community members, both young and old, and do a visioning of their threats, which they realize in three-dimensional papier-mâché recreations of their vulnerabilities. And for the communities, this is very often the first time they have seen a physical representation of their communities where they're able to map these threats. And it culminates in a mangrove reforestation project. So imagine you go to the health clinic and you end up replanting mangroves. This is amazing. This is incredible. But this is a way that you're really getting to disaster preparedness. It's getting at the community's needs at the core. You're focusing on health. You're mobilizing the community to understand their threats, and you're helping them develop these natural buffers that will absorb some of the shocks that they know will invariably occur. And I know that when I work with a lot of my colleagues who either work on climate change resilience or disaster preparedness, and I talk to them about providing health services to women and how that's an important disaster planning strategy, they tell me you're nuts. Well, this is the research. Based on the research of this type of intervention, we know that when you provide these kinds of services for women, you provide these health services, you empower them in their social role, their economic role, and the health role, and it results in increased income and assets. They have better decision-making capability over where they live. There's increased educational attainment. They're better stewards of the environment, and they're better engaging in community participation. These key areas are actually the key building blocks of resiliency planning. So it's quite interesting that you look at a health intervention that helps develop resilience, but is also very effective of helping communities and individuals prepare for disasters. And we've seen this. This is from some of the work that we have done with colleagues in Bangladesh and other parts of the region. After Cyclone Cedar in 2007, we saw as many as 50% of the girls in my school who dropped out because they got married and their parents needed their income from bride price. So this is quite an interesting phenomenon. We look at the impact of disasters and these hazards on communities and girls and try to get a sense of their welfare. It's fascinating to understand these connections. So here at the Wilson Center, we work with a number of investigative journalists who uncover these issues. And a couple of our colleagues had looked at this in the northeastern Indian state of Assam. And what they found in Assam was that following floods that had destroyed several villages, many families and young girls in particular were displaced. Some of them were found and came back to their communities. But at the same time, many of these villages were undergoing a certain degree of conflict. There was a wave of ethnic violence. So you had these floods, and then you had insecurity and conflict that was coming in. A number of people in the communities were killed. What our journalists discovered was that human traffickers were tracking these trends, and they were looking specifically at these communities to determine how these hazards and threats and disruptions were playing out. One of these traffickers said, it's going to be flooding, there's all of this ethnic tension, I'm going there to look for girls, to traffic in girls. So it's fascinating when you see these connections. When the community started to realize what was going on, they then mobilized themselves and said, okay, we need to keep track of what's happening. Are there girls that are dropping out of school? Are there girls that are suddenly very well dressed? What's happening? And they kept in touch and kept monitoring the situation and would alert the families and mobilize the communities to encircle those girls and protect them from the traffickers. So an example of very innovative community mobilization around flooding, disasters, conflict, and communities putting in place their own indigenous safeguards to protect themselves around this. So it's really, really fascinating to see what's happening at that level. We've also had colleagues who have looked at the possibilities for peace-building dividends around disasters. So one of our colleagues was looking at cases in Thailand and Sri Lanka to have a sense of how disasters can exacerbate fragility or whether they offer opportunities for peace. So they started by looking at what was happening in Thailand in 2011 when there were a number of extreme weather events, a lot of flooding, a lot of protests in the street, and trying to get a sense of what this meant for how the government and officials and the military were dealing with this conflict. They further looked at examples in Sri Lanka and Indonesia in the post-2004 tsunami. And what they found was that in Indonesia, that there was a deliberate attempt to build peace that was tied in with the disaster relief efforts. They refer to it as disaster diplomacy, an opportunity to build back better, whereby the disaster provided opportunities for cooperation and engagement that got the community behind them. And this did not happen in Sri Lanka. And in fact, in Sri Lanka, it played on ethnic tensions. So then, once again, just an opportunity to think about the peace-building possibility and dividend around disasters. So I say overall, we think of disasters and these kinds of approaches at a community level as potentially offering what we call triple dividends. So avoiding the actual damages that will occur. There's a development dividend that's looking at how you unlock a development potential around innovation and economic activity. And then there are co-synergies that emerge in a social, environmental, and economic co-benefits of disaster risk management. So what are you putting in place before the disaster occurs that provides benefits benefit and pave the way. So I think ultimately, when we think of these kinds of approaches at a community level, we remember the faces of the most vulnerable and appreciate that there are opportunities to engage at this level also. So we capture a lot of these stories and this work through the work that we do here in my program, and you can find out more about us at newsecuritybeat.org. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, Mark, and that very clear explanation of showing the links between investing in human capital and leading to resilience. That's really great, and I will forever remember going to a health clinic and leading to mangroves is a great example of that. But I have to raise the somewhat uncomfortable truth, which is the Trump administration has made the decision to withdraw from the Paris climate treaty agreement. There's a lot of skepticism about the role the US EPA plays, what it believes in. There's a lot of concern about whether the science behind global warming and climate change are valid or not here in this country. How does that impact the kind of stories that you're telling, the kind of investments that governments are putting in to these efforts?
I think it's an excellent question. I'm not sure I agree with the last statement that you made in your introduction to the question, whereby there is a lot of disagreement and dialogue around the science. I think the science is well established and is well respected internationally. What we see at the level of these community efforts and what we see happening at the level of a Bangladesh, for example, is that the government has stepped up to the plate. The government of Bangladesh has implemented a national climate fund that's supported by the government to help them begin to respond to these kinds of threats and hazards. It's not enough. But there's a certain degree that, the U.S. needs to be involved. If this is not going to happen at a federal level, there is increased engagement at a city level, and more we know that many of these programs and projects are looking at how they can continue to engage with the United States, but if not at the federal level, at other levels. At the same time, there are questions about the financing mechanism. So the Green Climate Fund, what is going to happen to that? One of the key questions around this is the concept of loss and damage, which is looking at the damages will occur, and for those communities who will lose part of their heritage or lands or may be displaced, what happens to them, and how do we finance that? So there's some broader, bigger questions, but I would say in general, we are seeing a lot of these vulnerable countries come together, and it has renewed their interest and commitment to collaborate and forge ahead. It's quite significant that this year the Conference of Parties is being hosted by Fiji, that is very vulnerable in itself, but really pushing ahead on this agenda. So there's renewed commitment. The work continues. There is still a strong need for the United States to be involved, and international partners are looking at how they engage, if not at the federal level, then at subnational levels, at the level of cities and municipalities.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, but before I turn to the audience for questions, I want to give the opportunity for our panelists to poke holes, respond to each other. If not, do you have any comments to each other's talks?
I was just going to add, I was really pleased to hear what Jim had to talk about and discuss, because we do a lot of work here at the Wilson Center on environmental security, and particularly looking at how we engage the military establishment. So we do quite a strong body of work around climate risks and what it means for military engagement. And I fully agree with your point that they should not be called upon first. but very often they are the ones who are strategically positioned and logistically able to deploy. So what I don't know if you would agree with this, but what we are finding more and more, even though it is not ideal, we are being put in situations where we need to call on the military to respond to these threats. And I think that, for me, that's an additional point of why this is so important for us to pay attention to. The military ideally is not set up to engage in disaster situations, but is being called upon more and more to do so. So it really is something for us to pay close attention to.
Well, and I think as long as we don't overdo it, there is strong desire on the military side too to use the disaster relief dynamic as a way to get at some of the other things that they want to accomplish, which is to engage with more partners and players, to have greater interoperability in multilateral coalitions. What I don't know if they fully appreciate yet, and I tried to get to that connection, is, and you brought that out very well in your presentation about the linkages, because it is these issues of environmental health that lead to fisheries collapses, that lead to greater national territorial expansion, pushing out of fishing fleets, which then the military feels, they're worried about rules of engagement with other militaries, the idea of a fisherman's militia, maritime militia out and about in the paramilitary dynamic. So it's not a large jump to go from some of these points that you and Alan brought together to the higher level of military readiness and military interaction. And an appreciation of that and the linkage of that, I think, won't solve everything, but it could help us be more effective at each of the things that we're trying to do. So there are US and Japanese programs, along with Australia and others, to enhance maritime domain awareness among Southeast Asian countries, for example, primarily to help protect their fishing zones and areas. But there's a pushback against China dynamic there too, and kind of balancing against coercion. But if we keep some of the focus on maritime domain awareness, the G20 foreign ministers meeting recently had an agreement for the first time on illegal and underreported fishing initiatives and efforts, and we need to keep a high level of diplomatic activity on these types of instruments and initiatives, because they link quite directly to some of these higher end security issues we keep spending billions of dollars to deal with.
All right. I see a couple of hands. Perhaps we can take the first question here.
Hello, Tristan Martinez, Texas A&M University. For Mr. Schroff, so you mentioned ARDEX, and as someone who writes and reads these types of simulations, resilience and human actions are really hard to factor, especially considering the socioeconomic and educational differences between the players and the people they're trying to simulate. In your view of ARDEX, how have they approached this, and what other simulations would you recommend reviewing?
Well, I haven't personally been involved in an ARDEX exercise. I've been involved in some others. What I think we're finally getting better at, as I understand it, is expanding our interaction with different components of the host country. So in the Philippines case, for example, the first iteration of DREX did not necessarily involve many of the domestic-oriented ministries and departments in the Philippines. It was kind of a more foreign ministry defense initiative, and the more recent iterations to have dealt with local government representatives, the health and welfare ministries, transport ministries, dealing with some of the regulations and issues that how does an affected country welcome and involve a wide range of non-governmental and other governmental players, issues surrounding the introduction of military forces and rules related to that, and pre-negotiating some of those things. So my one main issue, I think, as a general comment, is to keep pressing the envelope of this idea of interagency cooperation, not only among the various players that are participating, but also in the host country itself, and then that comes together with the private sector dynamic, because they will eventually be leaders. The large private companies in many of these countries will theoretically be leaders in response to their own country. But I know that's an imperfect response to the Arctic's question in particular.
All right, the gentleman in the middle.
Having observed U.S. behavior in our coastal regions, I'm afraid I already know the answer to this, but is there any movement at the governmental level not to allow people to rebuild in places that are devastated?
I would say it really depends on the country involved. It's difficult to generalize. There's of course always a push for local residents to reoccupy the only areas that they can find as vulnerable and landless people. There's been also in some cases more awareness and willingness to establish rules either by the government or the community that we should not rebuild so close to the sea. I've heard about some cases in Sri Lanka in particular. So I think it's difficult to generalize, but the forces, the push factors I mentioned in terms of urbanization, rural migration, lack of land, I mean, these are structural forces that are difficult to struggle against.
I just offer a couple other perspectives to build on what Alan is saying. You know, so for us in the United States, communities that are displaced due to a disaster, if they want to access any federal funding, there's something called the Stafford Act, and the Act does not allow them to get funding or support unless they move back to where they have been displaced. Okay, so if you're in a coastal area and there's a flood and you've been displaced, you will not get federal support unless you rebuild in that area. Okay, so we know that there's some of that going on, and there are communities that we have worked with in Alaska, in Louisiana, that have been told by the Army Corps of Engineers that their communities will be underwater, and they have taken action to proactively relocate. And they're having problems because they're not able to get the funding. So it's actually for community some of these communities have spent 5 years planning their relocation. And so the questions of funding and policies that try to support some of this is sometimes quite a challenge. We are also looking at what's the role of the insurance and reinsurance industry in this context. So to what degree are there any risk insurance pools and risk management pools that allow communities to move back? How is that risk covered? Those are some of the things that we're also looking at. So there's a question of the degree to which there are incentives at a regulatory level. There are questions around even when communities want to engage and put in place a planning process, they may come up against some roadblocks. And then there's the role of the insurance industry, which is a big deal. And actually, we, the Wilson Center, are collaborating with the Hoover Institution and Stanford University, and we're holding an all-day conversation on this next week on the 19th at Stanford University, and November 20th here, we will be dealing with these questions both with international and U.S. partners on coastal issues.
So you'll just have to come back, right? Yes.
In a recent Financial Times weekend paper, I think it was probably 2 weeks ago, there was an article having to deal with reclaiming land and building up the areas around what were formerly lowlands and floodlands in the Netherlands. So rebuilding the land was accomplished to some degree in New Jersey after Sandy, because they had to rebuild the beach to preclude having greater damage in the future storms. The Corps of Engineers do a lot of work. They did a lot of work after Katrina to restructure the dikes, the levees, and the waterways to account for flow of water, and also the regeneration of the mangroves. So things can be done, but the trouble is with something like that is once you reclaim the land and you sort of regain it for use, the people who couldn't afford to live any place else would no longer be able to afford to live in the places that you reclaim because you make it too expensive for them. So it's kind of a strange cycle.
Absolutely. And this is a more extreme example of a central government taking a much more proactive and heavy-handed role. But in Japan, in the rebuilding after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, the flip side is they are investing in raising the level of some of the low-lying lands. But a lot of that fill is coming from leveling mountaintops back inland and dragging that fill back to the front. And actually, primarily, they're looking at people for housing to move back to the flattened, opened areas of land, and it'll be other types of industry-led industry fishing and other commercial activity on the front that can be more easily abandoned and insured. But it's a very holistic. I've been to see some of what's going on. I was there a couple of years ago, and they're still in the process of it, although getting along. But if you can afford it and the people are willing to support that kind of an approach, that's a long-term solution to that kind of vulnerability.
Shioka, I have a question, if it's okay for me to ask. I'd love to hear from my fellow panelists a little bit on a question that we always struggle with, which is where does development end and humanitarian assistance kick in, or vice versa? Because when we engage with a lot of our partners in the humanitarian space, they say, our role is to respond. You talk about long-term structural issues that get into development space. And, we think of how we engage the military. So there's a role for the military, the development community, and humanitarian community. How do you see those communities playing together in this space? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I do think that the military role should be as limited as possible. And the issue of transition is also very, very important. And so these communities need to understand each other and what their needs are and their priorities. There's a great famous story after the Indonesian tsunami of, I think the military staying a little bit too long and trying to rebuild, getting into the building process of building schools and things like that. Or in one area where they were doing cleanup, NGO had a very meticulous program of separating the material and the trash and all the stuff that had been destroyed, separating it out in terms of wood and metal and scrap and what could be reused and what couldn't. And the U.S. military came in and said, oh, this is going to take forever. Here, we'll help you. I got a big bulldozer. They dug a big hole and they pushed everything in and sealed it up. And local people were ultimately kind of furious with the whole thing because they were trying to, it was a cultural issue. They were putting people to work. They were actually providing very modest but some means of compensation for the people who were doing this work, and you know, the disconnect between solving a problem one way versus solving a problem another way. It was all well-meaning, but that's just in that initial transition phase, and then I'm less familiar with than you get from the relief to the redevelopment or reconstruction, restoration, and that's probably a whole nother host of delicate transition challenges.
Yeah, I think it depends how you define humanitarian. We oppose in some way the Wilsonian tradition to the Junantist. I belong to the latter with a few organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross or Médecins Sans Frontières, where we believe that our role is to remain impartial and neutral in conflict areas and even in disaster situations, which means that we believe that our role is to remain as little as possible. We don't think that we are part of the social fabric and the political development of a particular country. I think that involves development. Think, for instance, of the laws regulating land allocation, land property, redevelopment. These are very complex issues in which we do not feel we are competent. So that's more the role of the local political process, of the local communities, of the government, of national laws, and so on and so forth, with the support of if needed, of development organizations, but we believe it's not our role. That's a different kind of conception.
All right. So with that, we've actually reached the end of our discussion. And so I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our three panelists, Roger, Mark, Jim, and Alain. And I want to thank you too for joining us. I would also like to invite either Jacques or Alain to, Alan. Alan to conclude our discussion.
Well, thank you all for a terrific second half of our conference here today. And I once again want to thank the staff that's made this possible here at the Wilson Center, as well as my colleagues Tom Shattuck and Rachel Hemler at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Just a couple of concluding thoughts on what has been in some ways an eclectic pair of topics. I mean, they're both non-traditional security. And someone was asking me, how did you decide to put these two together? And like most camels, it was a horse designed by a committee. Shoko and I had a number of backs and forths about things that were interesting and things we hadn't done before. But actually, there are things that sort of connect this, that this last panel, I think, has really brought home. One is that both these areas, non-traditional security areas of cybersecurity and disaster relief, resilience, and assistance, are areas where the threats and challenges are obviously huge and only likely to grow in the years ahead. To use the language of the more security-focused panel this morning, the targets are getting bigger. As economies become more digitally based, as even old things like power plants and water grids, water treatment systems and such become linked to the Internet of Things. As more countries develop, they become more economically dependent on cyber vulnerable technologies and so on. So the targets are much bigger for cyber attacks and cyber collapses of one sort or another. And as you just heard from this panel, urbanization and other factors bringing people more and more into harm's way. To take the other half of that military metaphor from this morning, the threats are going up too. Obviously, the offensive capacities in cyber warfare are proliferating and they're spreading to non-state actors more and more, although the biggest ones are still states. And in climate change, we're creating the weapons through making people more vulnerable to disasters in a variety of ways. What we also, I think, have heard a lot of is the linkage between non-traditional security topics, the type we've been dealing with here, and traditional security. Not only are militaries now technologically vulnerable as well as technologically capable, that is, cyber disruption could wreak havoc on military capacities, and national security weaponry now includes a lot of information-based attacks. And we've just heard about how, although the military role shouldn't be expanded or made larger than it needs to be, there's a huge military component in disaster relief, not only in the role that navies and others play in responding to disasters, but also the questions of the security threats posed by collapsing economies, collapsing fisheries, competition over territory, human displacement, and the other things that come with natural disasters. The other thing we see is these non-traditional security issues being linked to traditional foreign policy. We heard in this morning's session a lot about how cyber warfare is normal warfare by other means. It's another domain of conflict that's on the spectrum of escalation, perhaps, and that it is an area where new techniques, seemingly new techniques, are used in the service of foreign policy goals that are just part of the national interest or national preference. We've seen more and more security cooperation among allies to deal, as we heard in this panel, with, and as we heard at the luncheon keynote as well, countries that already have pretty good relationships are probably in a better position to cooperate among themselves in responses to disasters and in terms of delivering possible assistance to others. Only a couple more points here. One is, that came through a lot, is also the profound asymmetries of the topics we've been talking about. Cyber vulnerability is extremely asymmetrical. South Korea, we've heard, is so connected that it could get whacked in any number of ways. North Korea, about as disconnected as you can get, but even seemingly unlinked places may have cyber vulnerabilities. And that there is, of course, another kind of asymmetry. We heard about how North Korea and other states with relatively low vulnerabilities can engage in asymmetric warfare because they can make things hurt in a way that they can't so easily be hurt, although we may be developing the techniques to do that. And of course, as we've heard on this panel, the risks of climate change and other kinds of natural disasters, partly man-made disasters, is obviously much greater in poorer countries than in richer countries, and it varies by socioeconomic class as well. There's a lot of that kind of variety. And finally, I think one of the messages to take away from this is the failure to invest. That there are some very high rate of return investments that are not being made. We heard on the first panel about how some very simple fixes could keep the subways and the power plants and such from cyber vulnerability, and we're not doing that. There are other things, of course, which would be much more expensive to prevent IP theft and so on. So there's not only an underinvestment, there's a sort of lack of kind of cost-benefit analysis of the investments that goes on. As we've heard here, we know a lot of what we can do to deal with vulnerability from natural disasters. Some of it isn't even that expensive, but a lot of it is not being done. And so I look forward to further conversations and learning from the people who've joined our panels generously today. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's given me a lot to think about. And this is, I think, the kind of thing we love to see at this kind of conference, that is both deep and insightful analysis of the problem and a genuine focus on trying to come up with solutions with a fair amount of modesty about how hard those are going to be to achieve. With that, I thank you all again for joining us. I thank Shihoko and my co-organizers here, and I especially thank our panelists and our audience for a terrific day. Thank you.